Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Welcome to Superhumanize, where we explore the wisdom and traditions that connect us to our roots, our purpose, and the universe itself. Today, we have the incredible honor of hosting Kumu Ramsay Taum, a revered cultural practitioner and spiritual leader whose work in integrating Native Hawaiian values into modern contexts is truly evolutionary. Kumu Ramsay is a living bridge between the ancient and the modern. Trained and mentored by some of the most respected Hawaiian elders, he is a master of several Native Hawaiian practices, including Ho'oponopono, a powerful process of reconciliation and healing, Lomi, an art of body alignment and healing, and Kaihewalu Lua, the formidable Hawaiian martial art. His journey has been deeply influenced by the belief that true warriors must first be healers, a philosophy that stands in stark contrast to some of today's often misunderstood notions of strength and masculinity. Imagine a man who, with nothing more than a calm smile and subtle movements, can disarm larger, highly trained opponents, because for Kumu Ramsay, the essence of combat is not in the violence, but in the preservation of peace and balance. In our conversation today, we will explore not just the techniques, but the profound spiritual and ethical foundations that guide these practices. Kumu Ramsay's contributions go far beyond personal mastery. As the founder and president of the Life Enhancement Institute of the Pacific, he has been a transformational leader, advocating for the integration of cultural and place-based values into business and community models. His approach is a call to honor our interconnectedness and to operate from a place of respect, reciprocity, and sustainability, a message that is critically needed in our world today. And today we'll talk about his personal journey, about what it means to be a true warrior, and how ancient Hawaiian principles can guide us toward a more balanced, respectful, and connected way of living. Get ready to be inspired by Kumu Ramsay, where the wisdom of the past meets the possibilities of the future. Kumu Ramsay, what a pleasure to see your face again. And thank you so much for making time to come onto the Superhumanize podcast. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's likewise good to see you again. It's been a while. It's always the exactly right time.
Indeed, Kumu, all in divine timing. And just so the audience knows where we know each other from, I had the pleasure and privilege to attend the Aniwa meeting a few months past, gathering of over 50 Indigenous elders, teachers, leaders, amongst them you. I attended a few of your workshops, which have left an indelible mark on my soul, on my heart. And I also had the opportunity to speak with you, to have a session with you in private, which was truly wonderful. So again, gratitude for that.
You're welcome. Thank you for participating.
I would have not missed it for the world, Kumu. And I would like to start this conversation by reading a quote that I saw on your Instagram just today. And also it relates to what we just spoke about before we actually hit record. Let me just pull that up.
Yeah, sure.
So on Instagram, you wrote, "This is the season for reversing the negative manifestations of war, social, and ecological injustice, and realign ourselves to the higher frequency and currency of aloha."
Yeah, thank you for bringing that forward.
Yes, and it just really aligns with what we just spoke about, which is peace
Yes.
and peacemaking and extending the inner peace to the outside. And could you explain to us, Kumu, what aloha actually means? I recall you also shared it with us during one of the workshops.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Aaron. There is, I think, a common understanding among all of us on island Earth. I refer to our wonderful gem that we all are occupying and traveling through space as island Earth. And I think there is always a connection to one another, to our places, the understanding of treating one another respectfully. and acknowledging our spirit identities and not just our physical identities. Whether we remember it or not, I think there's an underlying connectivity there. I think aloha is one way, at least here in Hawaii and in the Pacific, of how we express that understanding, that beingness. And while those who may be familiar with Hawaii have come here, they've heard that we are called the aloha state. Right? And you might say the state of aloha, which is a being, a way of being, but the physical state. They will likely also hear that it's used as a greeting, right? To say hello or say the goodbye. And while it is those things in that limited sense, aloha is really much bigger than that. It is really a way of being. It's an essence. While there is a noun, there is also the verb. And I like to suggest it's more the verb than it is the noun. It's the way we treat one another. It's the way we treat ourselves. I like to say we teach people how to treat us. And then if we're expressing and living aloha, this spiritual principle, a concept, it really is an expression and a demonstration that says, your air is my air is your air. I have no intention of damaging that air while we're together. And when I express in word and hopefully support in deed and action, we will acknowledge that we are really the same beings, the spiritual being. We understand who we are. So that when we're communicating, it's not kumu to Arian, but it is I to I. And I, in this case, the greatest divine spirit, whatever we might want to call it in our particular traditions, the I am, the God, the creative thing in all of us. And so aloha is tied to that understanding that what I'm seeing in front of me is a reflection of me. And the best thing to do if I want to treat myself well, I should also treat that image of me outside of myself. And the concept of aloha can be broken down into several root terms or words because our language is a spiritual language. It's a way of communing with spirit. And when you break it down into its largest root components, the word aloha really says to be in the presence of, to be face to face, to be connected with that spiritual life-giving breath of the person or thing in front of you. So when we say alo, that first term, it says to be in the presence, to be nose to nose. And if you see Polynesians in Hawaii in particular, you'll see us greet one another with that. This notion of placing our nose on one another's nose and our forehead. It's really an expression and exchange of breath, and clearly a sign of trust to get that close, right? The second term is ha, in Hawaiian, the life-giving breath. That term ha acknowledges that spirit, that first thing you get when you come to the planet, the last thing you give back when you leave. It acknowledges that in between that first and last breath, we don't own it, but it is a gift from the divine, that spiritual breath, which means that the divine is within each and every one of us. And all things, really, that benefit from that life-giving breath. So the creatures that fly, crawl, and swim at the bottom of the ocean or in the highest forest, we're all connected. So aloha is that principle that speaks to the idea of leaving things and people whole, better than when we found them. And in the process, leaving ourselves whole as well. And so this is the deeper spiritual principles and concepts that hopefully guide our behavior, not just how we say it or what we say, but really how we live and demonstrate it. So I'm always looking for aloha, not necessarily listening for it.
That is beautiful, Kumu Ramsay. I really love that. And I am deeply grateful that the present reflection that I am looking at is you. I must have done something very good, at the very least today, to have you be my reflection. And what you and what you shared about the breath that
Yes.
you breathe is my breath, it brought to mind something I read quite a little while ago, that in essence, the particles of air that we breathe right now, that there are particles in there that our mothers breathed as they gave birth to us. So truly, and of course, this goes on and on, whatever takes your fancy, positive or quote negative, the particles of air that we right now breathe were breathed by, I don't know, Johann Sebastian Bach or Friedrich Nietzsche.
That's right. Every avatar and spiritual guide, and perhaps even those who weren't as spiritual and perhaps were misguided in their life. We've all shared that air.
Mhm.
And I think it's safe to say that is what's common. In as much as we may say the ground is common, we're always looking for common ground. It's a term we like to use. Yet we know that we don't treat ground as that common thing. We draw lines on it. We call them borders. We put up fences. We distinguish mine versus yours. So it really isn't as common as much as we like to call it that. But what is common is the air that we breathe. We share it with all things. Like I said, we don't own it. We may steward it for a while it's within us, but we're giving it back. It's something that you cannot keep. It's something that is reciprocal, which is the foundation of aloha as well, a reciprocity agreement of giving as well as receiving. And so I don't know that anyone can take a breath, though we may use those words. You can't really ever take it anywhere except within yourself, which is really more receiving than it is taking. And then eventually you have to give it back. So I don't know how many people want to try to keep it for themselves. It's a difficult proposition.
Yes.
And as you suggested, every creature, every being, at some point in time, the earth has breathed out as we've breathed in, whether it's the trees, the forests, the birds, the fish, and our fellow two-leggers walking on the planet. That air has come through us, that oxygen has come through us. And so, yes, we know from science that none of it ever disappears. It just becomes something else.
Mhm.
And so it's another way of saying we're all connected, if
Yeah.
anything, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And I love how you just put it, Kumu, that of course we have the phrase to take a breath, but really it is receiving. And if we want to align taking with what usually is considered more masculine in essence and receiving with what is more feminine in essence, then life, breathing is in essence something very feminine.
that's right.
Yes. And
It's a soft action, right?
yeah.
In as much as we may struggle to take in a breath when we are breathless, that rush of air, but it's really that soft feminine nature of it that now embraces our hearts and our lungs. And so, yes, some of us may act in a much more masculine way, which refers back to my comment about man infestation, right? That notion that we've, at the risk of saying infested things, but we've really imposed upon our spaces and one another this very masculine roughness. And while there's good balance, you need the both. I think we've been out of balance. And I think similarly, just in the simple steps of breathing, to receive that with gratitude rather than taking it out of desire.
Hmm.
It speaks to our mindset and our heart set for sure.
Profoundly so, Kumu. And what you mentioned before about another phrase, finding common ground, unfortunately, it seems so much, and this is also what you were referring to in the quote I read of yours, that we do not even treat the ground with reverence, the ground that we are of, that we came from, that we definitely are part of. There is no separation.
Yeah, it challenges our very foundation of thinking and behaving. Just the concept of thinking we can actually own property, in this case, land. Well, you may have other things, but land itself. And here you are sitting in front of this beautiful image of our island home known as planet Earth. And yet, how can we own that which we come from? I am not sure that I can own my mother any more than she owns me in the physical sense. So consequently, how can I own Earth or any part of it when we are all from it? If anything, what we do own is the stewardship responsibility to care for that relationship. And if we're wondering why we've been treated or experiencing the treatment we are, whether it's bad air, bad water, bad food, it's really a reflection of our behavior with and on mother, not her behavior towards us. And if it is reciprocal, we are only receiving what we've put in, or in this case, taken out, without a balanced response of restoring what it is that we've taken. Yeah. So
Very
unlike all of that, yeah, that's what it is.
Very much so, Kumu. And I also have this wish, this desire, this hope, this knowledge that the stewardship is possible for us on and from this beautiful planet, that we have just this incredible joy and privilege of being born from it and into it and living here. My goodness. And also, if you look at all the discussions that we're having nowadays about going into space, going into Mars, wouldn't we rather export stewardship than actually bringing devastation to other places? And thinking about Earth also as our mother, our ancestor in the sense, and how we're connected to all things. I would like to talk a little bit more about your background, Kumu. You've had extensive schooling, training, wisdom shared by revered Hawaiian kupuna, which is, if I understand it correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, which are ancestors in a way, not necessarily blood lineage. And this also is testimony to the rich tradition of the wisdom that is shared through generations. Can you share with us a little bit of your path?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, in our cultural worldview, an island worldview, if you would, there's an acknowledgement that to know where you come from is an important aspect of life, which helps you to know better where you're going, if anything, so you can look back and determine your progress or lack of progress. And so to know who you are, where you come from, and who contributed to that is a very critical component. Therefore, as one might say, another elder, Kupuna, told me, from root to fruit. As the fruit of the tree or the forest that we come from, do we know the roots well enough, which is our kupuna? And interesting enough, that term kupuna actually embraces the first four words or four letters of kupu, that thing to come up from, to rise. As in the first, one of the first plants that comes out of a lava flow is kupu kupu. It's a fern, some might know the fishtail fern. Our kupuna are the source. Puna means source, as in a spring. So kupuna is actually the source of man, ku, to stand up, to present, as in to rise. So the term kupuna captures all of this. It's the source of man, the source of the human condition, which fundamentally would be our grandparents and our ancestors before. And so I was fortunate that several of these kupuna recognized that they had an empty coconut in front of them. And they took the opportunity to fill that coconut with some of what we say their mana'o, their opinions, their thoughts, but more importantly, their ike, their wisdom. And I say that reverently, going back to your reference to the word earlier, the difference between reference and reverence. So I don't just refer to them, but I revere the fact that they were willing to take the time and the interest to pass this knowledge, this wisdom, and more importantly, the aloha on to me for the very purpose of carrying that on with others, as we're doing now, sharing it with others. And so there were several of them that at some point in time took some interest or saw that I had an interest, and perhaps maybe even say that the soil was ripe and rich for the planting of the seeds, which they did do. And others then came around to nurture those seeds, to give me an opportunity to find expression, right, in use of those, and not just hoard them and become a seed bank for a time in the future, but really to do that. But it took some weeding. It took some weeding. It took some rethinking of the traditional educational process that most of us go, primarily from a continental worldview. And it's hard for me to say Western, especially when we live on a sphere. There's always someone more West than you. But the continental worldview, one of exporting or extracting and going away, leaving, right? Go west, keep going until you find the island worldview doesn't operate from that perspective. We don't really have an exit strategy, if you would. We are here, we're living in our places, our ancestors are here, and hopefully our descendants will be too. And so in that perspective of then how do you live successfully in a place like Hawaii, which is considered the most remote place on the planet in terms of an inhabited place. You don't get to Hawaii by accident. There needs to be some intention to get here as well as to stay here. And so to live in a place like this for hundreds, if not thousands of generations requires the ability to transfer knowledge and wisdom so that, one, you can learn from the mistakes of your ancestors, but more importantly, align your behaviors, your practices with your environment. And in our case, with our relatives, the relatives being nature, the forests, the oceans, and all the creatures and beings that reside there. And so this was an important component, an underlying process of what I would say communing, how to commune with that environment, which is different than communicating. Communing is a process that there's an understanding, there is an exchange that's going on in the absence of words, but it's about spirit, it's about energy, it's an elemental thing, which goes back to our language, an elemental language, really less for the purpose of communicating as you and I are now, but really for the purpose of communing with those elements of spirit, the air, the wind, the water, the land, air, and sea. And so these kupuna, these elders, were gifted tradition after tradition, and they found fit or thought it was okay to share that with me. And so it was through a meandering of my own at some point in time, never really a straight line. And if you ask me 64 years ago, had I anticipated being here in this place now, I could probably say no. It was not an aspiration, a desire of mine to be here, to be now, to be Kumu. That was farthest thing from my mind. But what was clear for me then was always to be in service. That was embedded within me. To be in a place that I can now articulate would be for my good and for the good of others. Now, I may not have articulated it that way back then, but that's what has evolved to understanding, is that to be in service, to be prepared, to be ready, to be available, right? But also to be mindful about these things. Now, in hindsight, I can say these things, but I think in my heart back then, without articulating that, that was the posture, that was the trajectory that I think I put myself on or was drawn into by the kupuna, by the elders, and by spirit. And I say that because there were times when I deviated from that. I allowed my conscious mind to seek other things, financial gain, and these types of more influential, or at least what appeared to be a place to be, because that was what society was doing at the time. Not that it's wrong, but for me, it was inappropriate. And I can say that because each time I stepped off the path, I was violently thrown back on or reminded, no, this isn't the room for you. You need to be in that other room.
Can you share in particular instance where it really hit you like a brick?
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, there are too many to talk about. But I have to say, I did attend the United States Air Force Academy and was fortunate at some point in time to actually be appointed to 5 military academies. So somewhere in my historical DNA, my karma is this war karma, right? And in this convergence, all of the institutions and the leaders in our community found it fit to say, hey, you should go there. And so while I had the choice of different academies, I chose the Air Force Academy. And it was while I was there, I went through a number of training programs, all of which were wonderful, great. I'd do it again if I could. But it finally led me to an understanding that was not the place for me, at least in this incarnation. And I was supported by the cosmos, by the universe and my ancestors. And I can literally say I had to lose my sight in order to gain my vision. I had planned to be and wanted to be a pilot, to fly. But of course, the kind of flight I was looking at were jets, fighters, which first for me is protection, but fundamentally is about war, right? And as I was there and experiencing this, that energy of killing, death, and justifying that, because in order to have peace, you have to fight for peace. It seems like an odd dichotomy to me, a paradox, if you would. And as I sat and listened more and more to this, I began to realize that I was misaligned, my spirit, my being. While my mental capacity and physical ability allowed me to be there and succeed in that space, there was a spiritual and mental misalignment. And it's not part of my character to give up on anything. So I probably would have stayed with that simply because my ego wouldn't let me walk away from it, right? That sense of everybody expects me to do this because you can. In fact, I had an elder tell me that, right? And so you live up to that expectation, that externality, that external metric of success. It turned out while I was there, my sight deteriorated, or at least they told me it did, to the point where I was no longer fit to fly in the cockpit, not as a pilot, but as a potential engineer or a navigator. Two careers I really wasn't interested in at the time, right? And so divinity, the cosmos, the spirits, the ancestors created a condition where by taking my vision, it gave me time, or I should say my sight, my physical sight, gave me time to refocus on my vision, right? And that vision become much larger than being an officer in the United States Air Force. And it allowed me to return to community sooner, and which has led to what I think I'm doing more today than I thought I was back then, which was really being a navigator in our community, a social navigator, a cultural navigator, and maybe even an engineer, a community social engineer, not for the purpose of misguiding people, but hopefully guiding us to a place of peace and harmony, which I was not experiencing while I was at the academy. And it was shortly thereafter, actually, while I was going through all of this, that you may recall US hostages were taken in Iran, right? So it was shortly after my departure that this occurred. And so here was this pivotal point in history and a pivotal point in my own destiny that I would leave just as that was occurring to find myself in a new setting, more legislative in Washington, D.C., and then being able to come home to Hawaii under the guidance of elders who had created a space for me. And it was returning to that space, right? And so while that was still a kind message, I wasn't injured physically or even emotionally. It was difficult because I had set a sight to myself. This is what the expectations were. But I think it was one of the first experiences that I had of letting go, right? And leaning into something that was greater than myself. And so fortunately, it allowed me to be around kupuna and elders who could then sharpen the sword, if you would, or maybe soften the edges so that I wouldn't poke myself or somebody else. Oh, sorry for the long answer, but
Not at all. This is really profound, and I'm so grateful you shared it, Kumu. It also brought to mind again something you said during one of the workshops where you actually talked about the also truly profound difference between a warrior and a soldier. And what I remember from that is that you said that a warrior learns how to fight, how to kill. The warrior, however, only employs it to defend self and the community. And so there's a very specific purpose to it. Whereas the soldier will just go out on command and do what's asked, whether that's destruction of certain objects or killing of individuals. And there's something that really impacted me when I witnessed you sharing a little bit of your you're probably not gonna like me saying your mastery of the little bit that I know you, but I'm just gonna say it as an outsider witnessing it. Your mastery of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Kaihewalu Lua, which is the Hawaiian martial arts. And you demonstrated not only physical skill, but a deep spiritual composure. I just remember you invited two men, or one of them was Ra, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and another man who both were trained. I believe the other gentleman was trained in Bagua. Both of them were bigger guys physically than you, and you just kept eye contact with the audience. You were looking at us all. You were smiling. You asked these two guys after each other to please punch you, to lunge at you, to punch you. They were reluctant at first. You said, no, please go for it. And you just kept smiling at us and talking. And you had very soft, gentle movements. And I just remember all of a sudden these big guys, both of them, like one of them was bent over. You had your hand in his face, and it was just a sight to behold. And it was really pretty incredible. And you also shared with us that this martial art is not only about self-defense and fighting, but it's a way of life. Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to be a warrior, and also what differentiates Lua from other fighting technologies or martial arts?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, that was fun. And I appreciate those gentlemen for allowing me to share that and for giving their bodies to the cause. Unfortunately, no one was injured, I don't think. No one complained about it. But I think they did experience, as you said, the mana, the energy, and the spirit, because I had no intention, as I do now, to do any harm. And yet, I hope the demonstration was to show that one can protect. And that's the point you're making, is that Kaihewalu Lua, in this case, Kaihewalu is the name of a particular family. Well, Lua is the name of the system, the methodology, the practice, which was or is the Hawaiian ancestral combat or battle art, right? And science. It's an art and a science, because you need to understand the engineering, the mechanics, the healing component. So there's science and art involved in it. So I'd like to say it's the art and science of the way of the Hawaiian warrior, and the way being the way of life, and not just a moment by moment thing where if something happens, you react a certain way. But if you recall, it's really about when, living in a way that when something occurs, it requires you to respond and not necessarily react, that you are prepared to do this. So I would like to say that Lua, much like Aloha, is a way of being which allows you to be present at all times in such a way that you can respond to an opportunity or a challenge and restore, if not actually remain in balance as you go through that. And so the art of Lua, this battle system, it's less a martial art from the standpoint it's only about philosophical training through movement, a walking, living meditation, if you would. But it's a way of engaging the first enemy that any of us have to deal with, which is the one within us. Whether it's fear, anxiety, or even aspiration or ego, that tends to be the first enemy. And the Lua warrior is always protecting that inner man, that inner being, versus just attacking the exterior outer being of another adversary or enemy. And so by dealing with the first enemy, the first adversary, which is oneself, one can now become much more centered in self and a little less self-centered when engaging others. And so consequently, when the warrior within can find that protection so that they can then protect others because they are no longer demonstrating an energy of, I would say, predatory energy, right? When they are no longer perceived to be the threat, but really a place of peace and harmony, then there really is no attraction from outside to attack that place of harmony. Unless, of course, someone is looking to exploit what they perceive to be weakness. Kindness perceived as weakness. Right?
Mm.
And this is why the warrior must be prepared to fight. But it's always predicated on protection, protecting oneself, one's place, family, things that are of high, great value. And in most cases, that protection really starts by being prepared, knowing what the potential harm might be, so that when you can leave, you can vacate, evacuate if you want. And the Lua warrior is trained at first to protect others, in this case, a chief. And the first thing you do is remove that chief from harm's way. And if you cannot remove that chief from harm's way, or your spouse, or your child, or whatever it is that's most important to you, that's when you must now confront that which is attacking you. And if you can, redirect that energy somewhere. And if it's not prepared to be redirected and chooses to continue, then somehow encourage them to stop. Right. And I say that with encouragement rather than discouragement. I'm not here to discourage you from fighting, by all means. I'd like to encourage you to stop. Because once you recognize that your continued effort is fruitless or potential can do harm to you, then maybe you'll rethink your intentions. So Lua is about that. By all means, I think as you saw, there is a point in there where the decision can be made. Do I break it or do I heal it? Right. And this is the dichotomy in Lua. Two, the opposing forces, which are really one force working in synchronicity. In as much as we have this dualistic worldview of left and right, up and down, the reality is that we're looking for balance so that they're in synchronicity all the time. And so Lua is about this, to find synchronicity, to be synchronized with things around you, but most importantly, to be synchronized within. So your mind, your body, and spirit are operating in one, which then refers to our Ho'oponopono experiences about finding mindfulness, being full, be complete in one's mind, and versus being mindless, mentally disturbed, physically or emotionally imbalanced. And so Lua is the opposite side, or the supporting side of Ho'oponopono, about making peace, making things right. And I would suggest in this brief conversation that they really are the same thing, one focusing more on the physical, while the other is focusing on the spiritual. And as spiritual beings living physical experiences, that would appear to be probably a good thing. Is to understand and how to manage that dichotomy, right?
Yes, yes, Kumu. And what really also struck me as you were demonstrating this and talking about this was how you shared that before you ever even learned this system of defending, of fighting, of encouraging others to stop the fight, you learned how to heal because it really stuck in my mind for quite a while because you also said that once you know that when you break something, it's also your responsibility to heal it. Why break it in the first place? And that you
Right.
had a long stretch of learning how to heal first before the kupuna even shared the wisdom and the knowledge about the lua with you.
Right. And I'm not sure that I went into that level of training with that awareness.
Mhm.
Right. But again, it's demonstrative of the fact that there are some tests you can't study for. You just have to go through that. And I think it's the way that the system, that the elders devised a tempering mechanism to determine who or what the right person would be for the receivership and the stewardship. That's not to say that they weren't also looking for people who are ready to dive head first into any skirmish, or we need those kinds of people who are fearless when it comes to that. But how do you turn them off in times of peace?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. There are soldiers who are prepared, and we need soldiers, but you also need warriors to protect them and also protect when they're done. How do you temper that? I don't mean to insult my soldier brothers and sisters, because we appreciate the fact that you are prepared to do that. But at some point in time, in the maturing of that soldier, there's a soldier in every warrior, but not a warrior in every soldier. Right. And the idea is, how do you get to warriorship to realize that you don't have to kill to protect? You don't have to maim to bring them peace. And you certainly don't have to destroy or injure physical or spiritual things in order to get your point across, right? And this is the part of the warrior reaches to the highest level, which is to be able to commune and or communicate, rather than being in the basement, where I call the lowest form of communication being violence.
Right.
Right. Because it requires me to reach a higher level so that when we see one another, the communication has already happened, but the communing has already happened. It's when the tiger sees you and recognizes you not as food, but as a fellow tiger. And being able to emit and emote that kind of energy to say that there's no harm here.
Right.
Therefore, there's no fear. And also, I'm not here to take anything from you. We have more than enough. And so this then lends itself to the underlying principles of abundance and safety, rather than, I think, in a world that we tend to live in today, which is driven in many ways by fear and scarcity. So a warrior is really subscribing to those higher principles, right? So that I can protect myself if need be. And because I can, let's just talk, right? That enhances the ability for communicating and getting our messages across, which requires us to then master the art of oratory. Right?
Yes. And also, you brought it up just a few minutes ago, Kumu, engaging in, or maybe mastering, practicing Ho'oponopono, which is a unique way of, I don't want to say conflict resolution. You actually said it's not about talking about conflict and focusing on conflict, but talking about how a world without conflict would look like. Before you go into sharing about Ho'oponopono, maybe we first mention some of the biggest misconceptions about Ho'oponopono. I live in Los Angeles. There are many people here who desire to bring peace and better understanding into the world. A lot of times you also hear concepts like Ho'oponopono talked about quite a few times, and especially after hearing you share with us what Ho'oponopono means and is, a lot of these people do not have the depth of knowledge and also the integrity of intention that you have. Let's leave it at that. So, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about Ho'oponopono? And then please share with us.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ariane, because I just think it's a tendency of the human condition to, because we call ourselves a human race, we're always racing somewhere. And so some of us don't necessarily take the time required to really understand those things that we're doing, but we want the benefits from it quickly. And so oftentimes we take shortcuts, or we'll, I guess, compress everything into a singularity, something that we can control and manage, especially something that is complex and much broader than perhaps we've experienced or have time to really understand and fundamentally control. I think control has a lot to do with that. But to your observation, yes, there are some misconceptions about what is an ancestral, ancient process versus one that has been distilled into a common, more quick use and application. So consequently, you give something up, right, in the process of doing something like that, shoving an elephant in a Volkswagen, if you would, right? If anything, this quick fix doesn't really do the underlying process, which is cleansing. We're just addressing an immediate symptom. And so that process has been reduced to a series of mantras, which many people have now come to understand as the Ho'oponopono process. But that's like going to a baseball game and calling it a hot dog because they serve hot dogs there. You're taking the result and you're applying that to the process when that's not the case, right? And I think that's what's occurred. Now, don't get me wrong, if that works for people, and in that moment, it allows them to deflect the negative energy or the harmful energy so that they can get to a safe place, then by all means. But recognize that oftentimes that does not change the underlying issues that created that harm or danger, which means you're likely to repeat it, if not once, many times. And if not completely eradicated or eliminated in this lifetime, if you subscribe to birth and rebirth, then there's a likelihood that you'll carry this on into the next classroom as you brought it from the previous one, right? And so the Ho'oponopono process, as you correctly surmised, it's not so much a conflict resolution process as much as conflicts may be resolved. And it's not even a problem-solving process as much as problems may be solved. But really, it's about removing the underlying conditions, the memories, the ingredients, if you would, that are oftentimes triggered by a word, a deed, a vision, a sound, a smell, that with that right word or sound, an emotion triggers these memories that then bring forth those things that become barriers and obstacles in our lives: anger, fear, anxiety, the need to run, the need to cry, the need to fight, right? Which really begins to shift our behaviors. So the Ho'oponopono process from an ancestral standpoint, though updated by Auntie Morna Nalamoku Simeona, I endearingly refer to her as Auntie, but Morna Simeona, she updated the process so that everyone, regardless of where they may be, regardless of what their cultural upbringing might be, the language that they use, could eventually benefit from this process of cleansing one's mind, spirit, and heart, so that we don't repeat these things and continue to bring about these barriers and obstacles in our lives and the lives of others, which is very different than the mantras that people are talking about, which really are expressions pulled out of the process to ask for forgiveness, to say you love one, when really it's about speaking to oneself. As we talked about earlier, the reflection, as I see in you, I see in me. And therefore, if I don't like what I see in front of me, I have to ask myself, what did I place in front of the mirror? What did I contribute to this expression that I'm now getting back at me? Because the guy next to me is not. They aren't upset. But what's upsetting me? And so it begs the question, what did I bring with me? What did I present to receive this kind of feedback? And therefore, looking at myself before trying to change others, and realizing the minute I begin to change, the response and the reflection begins to change. So the world outside begins to shift as much because we've shifted internally. Now, that may be hard for people to swallow, to think that something physical like a wall or even a war that's going on across the planet could actually be influenced by the way I'm thinking and behaving. I can tell you by being around Auntie Morna and being a student of hers, to see amazing things such as the Berlin Wall come down physically with the work that she was doing spiritually years leading up to that event. And she told me she was working on something like that. But of course, the conscious mind says, how are you going to bring down a wall? You need a big pick. You need a truck. But I witnessed it. I saw it. And I can tell you, it's quite a process when you have the level of faith to recognize that everything in the physical started out in the spiritual, right? At some etheric space, we had to have the idea first. And even to go back and challenge our own religious and spiritual upbringing and the words that we may have heard, such as, in the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was good. From our perspective, there was something that came before the Word, and that was a thought. And that thought was powered by an emotion. And with that emotion and that thought came the Word that then created or destroyed, which is why the Ho'oponopono process and this concept of Aloha and Lua really beg the question and ask us to rethink, what is it we're thinking? What are we feeling? The seeds of thought watered by the emotions of heart are given life on the life-giving breath of Ha that comes from your heart and your lungs. And so the minute you say that word, you've given it life, you've given that emotion, that thought, that intention, you've given it life, and you can't bring it back. It's now out to do what it needs to do in the world around us. So this process of Ho'oponopono really is about looking at oneself and how we've contributed to the world around us. Yeah.
And the powerful practice and process, amongst others, from creating the inner peace, creating outer peace. And we talked about it before we hit record. World Peace Day is coming up.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you would like to share with our audience with regards to this, Kumu?
Yeah, we all know, and I alluded to it here, that peace starts with us.
Mhm.
We've heard those things. And so I'd like to suggest that as we project and request and pray for the peace for others, that we look at ourselves and what it is that we're doing, not only to create peace, but also perhaps to create the challenges that lead to the fears of others that they don't experience peace. Really? So in the Ho'oponopono process, asking for forgiveness as much as extending it, right? To ask for forgiveness from those who find themselves in war, right? Running from harm. Please forgive us, forgive me for whatever I created in a world that's created a condition for you that I'm now seeing that you are having to live. It's not enough to me, say, asking them to stop fighting. If the reason that they're fighting or having a disagreement is because of things that I am doing in the world to encourage that fighting. For instance, if I need the resources in order for me to live in peace from a particular region of the world that has now created a tension in that world, in order for me to have that resource, then I've contributed to that tension, right? So it's not enough to ask others to stop fighting. It's not enough for us to ask them to find peace so that I can find peace. I think it's acknowledging that we are contributing as family members to this ongoing struggle, whether we see it or not. And it's, as one elder told me, it's acknowledging that the breeze we feel kissing our cheek is coming from the hurricane that's sitting out on the horizon, right? Is that it's a point of view, a perspective. So my wish for the hurricane to pass, right? So that everyone can get the kiss of the light breeze. Yeah. It's wishing for that much higher thing and not just for peace for myself, right? And equally important, peace is not just the condition or the absence of war. It's much more than that. It's about harmony. It's about balance. And in balance and harmony, then we can find peace. But I may be peacefully sitting in my home with you having a wonderful, peaceful conversation. And yet we know there are others out there who are in disharmony, dis-ease, looking for food, looking for a home, looking for care, looking for love. So can I really rest in my peace, knowing that my peace is predicated on their fear, their anxiety, their despair? It's a very difficult peace to live, knowing that I may be, if not through ignorance, but through arrogance,
Or
disregarding.
spiritual bypassing as well.
Exactly. It's all that. So I don't mean to make it, a burden for people. But if it is a burden, then we need to ask ourselves, what is it that is so burdensome that we cannot see in others that which we see in ourselves, which is a need for love, the need for peace, the need for health, the need for acknowledgement, right? And the need for peace. What is that? So I think as we go into the practice or into this time, international peace, it does start with each and every one of us. And every single time we engage in an act of kindness, in an act of forgiveness, in an act of acknowledgement of someone else's dis-ease, disorder, and illness, that we begin to add to the healing, not the fixing, but the healing. Because I think this is a healing. People aren't broken, right? They're in dis-ease or illness. And so each of us has an opportunity to contribute to the healing of that and not just the fixing of things.
Right.
So,
I think that's an incredibly important distinction. And I say that as a recovering fixer. So I hear you, Kumu, and I'm so grateful for your insights. I know our time is limited today. I could talk to you for hours, just absorb your beingness, your knowledge, and your wisdom, and your incredible kindness. For people who would like to learn more about you, who'd like to learn with you, because you have quite a few offerings that you put forth into this world. Can you share where they can find you and perhaps also about some of the offerings that are slated for the near future?
yeah, there's an immersion coming up here in Hawaii in October called Makali'i Rising, and it's 4 or 5 days. And that content, that invitation can be found on sixsunimmersions.com. And Ra was on this show before, and so he is the contributor and facilitator of that. And I happen to be fortunate to be, invited to be the contributor to that. My wonderful daughter has supported me by creating these social media outlets, right? Whether it's on Instagram or Facebook. So on Facebook, it's Kumu Ramsay Taum, and oftentimes the offerings are there. My friends at the Academy of Oracle Arts also have programs and services that people can sign up for. And then, of course, our family at Aniwa. And if you go to Aniwa's page, there are offerings there as well. So these are classes. Sometimes they're just reflections, which often helps people. So I do one-on-ones, group sessions. And as I like to say, I don't go where I'm not invited. But if communities feel that they have a family or an organization that they would like to share this wisdom and this opportunity for cleansing and healing, then I also entertain invitations to come and be in community, which I find is very powerful. In as much as this process today of the internet and world communication systems can be for education and sharing, I always find that the in-person experience is always a much more unique opportunity. So these are offerings for sure. Yeah.
Wonderful, Kumu. And I'll make sure to put all of that in the show notes. And I can only speak in the most highest terms about having a one-on-one with you. I had the privilege of doing so. I highly recommend it. It's like nothing else. And also, you work with businesses and
Right.
bring the healing power and the wisdom into those paradigms and processes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I often leave that off the table. But it's really about operating cultures,
Mhm.
right? Assisting and shifting the operating culture, which really starts with what our underlying beliefs are, which are often tied back to our fears or anxieties and perhaps metrics of success that need to be realigned to the world that we really want to move to. So, yes, I do work with numerous companies and organizations and corporations on a global level as well as a local and national level. But again, I don't go where I'm not invited. So thank you for opening that door.
Absolutely. Kumu, it was such a pleasure. So much gratitude to you. Mahalo. Aloha. It was just wonderful to be in your presence again.
Thank you. Aloha and mahalo to you, Ariane. Be well.
You as well.